Zach Johnson was born blind. He wasn't blind in the normal way, however. People couldn't see his eyeballs. They wouldn't open. While his parents, Spencer and Jennifer Johnson, were sad about this, his blindness also embarrassed them. People suspected that, like David and Bathsheba, whose first son died as punishment from God for things they did, Spencer and Jennifer must have done something to anger God. Or maybe Zach did something really naughty while he was in the womb. Nobody really knew. In spite of Zach's blindness, many folks still liked the Johnsons. They were humble and decent people, unlike the O'Connors, whose children were all healthy but did things like throwing rocks over the fence into people's swimming pools. Those O'Connor apples didn't fall far from the tree. Because people liked Spencer and Jennifer, Zach was a conversation that never really happened. People didn't want to embarrass the Johnsons. Most of the time, people just acted as if Zach didn't exist. If they saw the Johnsons together out in public, they would wave to them from a distance. Growing up, Zach felt the tension, and while he loved his parents, he knew things were different with his siblings. For instance, when his younger brother submitted a sappy poem about their cat Barney in the fourth grade contest, Spencer gushed about it in their annual Hanukkah letter. That same year, however, Spencer never mentioned Zach's accomplishment of reciting the entire book of Leviticus to his sixth grade class. Then there were hushed conversations between his parents that Zach overheard. How would Zach make a living? Who would take care of him when they were gone? Would he ever make any friends? Zach felt like nothing he did was enough. He was a burden. 2 years later, Zach had enough of this and left for the streets in the middle of the night, determined to make it on his own. His parents tried to get him to return home, but he refused, only moving further from home so they wouldn't have to watch him beg or be subject to local gossip. In that faraway neighborhood, he became a fixture on street corners with his tin pan and a mat to sit on. While he appreciated donations, however, he couldn't stand the way people would have conversations about him right in front of him, as if his ears were broken too. After a while, he started jumping into the middle of these conversations. When people realized he heard them, they would quickly shuffle off, rarely saying anything in response to him. He got used to being ignored, sort of. On slow days, when he wondered if he would be eating that day, there was one woman who would reliably drop by and clink a few coins into his cup. Zach could tell it was the same person by the way she walked. She wouldn't say a thing, but he was pretty sure it was his mom. She always smelled of dandelions in the spring. The woman never said anything, and he returned the favor, not wanting to embarrass her. He desperately wanted to feel her touch. One day, while out begging, Zach heard a group of men approaching. Drawing near, one of the men asked, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Zach's hair stood up on the back of his neck. "Hey," he blurted out, "who sinned that you were born stupid?" Though Zach couldn't see it, the rabbi smiled at Zach. "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," he said, making sure Zach could hear him. "You're a rabbi?" asked Zach. "I am," said the rabbi. Zach was taken aback. He had never heard a Jewish man, let alone a rabbi, come to his defense. The rabbi continued, "This man's blindness happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." That was too much for Zach. "Great," said Zach. "So my blindness is God's robust teaching moment. That's garbage." The rabbi was really starting to like Zach. "You misunderstand me, friend," he grinned. "Let me say it differently. There is so much suffering in the world, so much darkness. But love, compassion, and forgiveness can cut a healing pathway through and transform it, redeem it. And that's what I'm here for, to show the way. I'm here to show people the pathway to an abundant life." "Who are you?" Zach asked. One of the disciples replied, "He is Jesus, our rabbi." Then Jesus did something unexpected. He spit on the ground, and then picked up the clump of dirt, wet with his spit, and rubbed it between his thumb and fingers to form a paste. Zach recoiled when Jesus touched him on the shoulder. Touch can be that way when you're so starved for it. It's okay, Jesus said. And for some reason, Zach trusted Jesus. He felt safe in his presence and let his guard down just a bit. I'm going to put something on your eyes, Jesus told him, and then he gently rubbed the mud paste on the man's closed eyes. Leave this alone until you can wash in the pool of Siloam. Now go. Zach didn't know what Jesus put on his eyes, nor why he did it, nor what would happen when he washed at the pool of Siloam. He just knew he needed to do exactly what Jesus told him to do. He could feel it. It took Zach a while to find the pool of Siloam. He kept having to ask people to point him in the right direction, and he kept bumping into things along the way. The most annoying thing, however, was that the people kept telling him that if he simply wiped the mud out of his eyes, he would be able to see the way without bugging everybody. As he made his way, Zach thought about what just happened with this rabbi named Jesus. He wasn't sure why he trusted him, but maybe something good might happen. When he got to the pool, a little banged up, Zach waded out into the waters. He knelt down and the bottom of his tunic soaked in some water. He reached down and splashed water onto his eyelids, washing away the dried mud. And then it happened. For the first time in his life, it felt like his eyes might open. It happened gradually, but in time he started to see light. And when he looked in different directions, he saw different things. It felt so weird, so foreign. He saw shapes and colors, the pool and the sky. He saw people around him, some who were staring at him, wondering what he was doing. He looked down at his own hands, wet with water, and tears started to flow down his cheeks as he realized he was starting to see. For the first time in his life, he felt like he wasn't broken. He wasn't being punished. He even felt loved, not forgotten, by Jesus, and maybe even by God. Zach stood near the edge of the pool, simply taking in the beauty of the day. After a while, he started making his way home. He still didn't know where he was going, since nothing looked familiar to him, but at least he wasn't running into things. His life was different now. He could see. In time, Zach was back on a street corner. He wasn't sure where else to go. He recognized nobody since he hadn't seen any of them before, but others started to recognize him. Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? One person asked. Once they started talking, however, he started recognizing voices. No, said someone else. That guy was blind. This guy's eyes are wide open. He felt that old frustration of conversations about him going on around him like he wasn't there. I am that man, he replied. Why do people act like I'm not standing right here? Well, what happened? How is it that your eyes opened? Zach looked at him for a moment, wondering how to say this without sounding crazy. Finally, he just stated, A man named Jesus made some mud and put it in my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I did, and now I can see. Where's this man now? They asked, and what does he look like? I have no clue on either account, Zach said. I never saw him because I couldn't see. Imagine that. They must have thought Zach was being flippant, so they dragged him off to the Pharisees. They would sort this business out. The Pharisees around these parts were really strict and stern, and constantly enforcing Mosaic law as if their egos depended upon it. There was no rule too arcane to shove down the throats of others in the name of Yahweh. This Jesus character, whoever he was, violated one of the biggies, one of the Big Ten. He didn't keep the Sabbath holy because he apparently healed the blind man on the Sabbath. None of the other rank and file Jews could work on the Sabbath, so why did Jesus get to do it? The man needed to be taught a lesson, and the bystanders knew the Pharisees were just the people to do it. When they arrived where the Pharisees were stationed, Zach and the others found them silently striking an array of pious-looking poses, frozen in place as if in some competition with one another. Nobody was moving or saying anything, because the loser was the first to break the pose. Finally, one of them asked, barely moving his lips while otherwise maintaining his frozen pose, What is it? He was clearly annoyed at the intrusion in their really fun, non-working Sabbath activity. Zach's self-appointed handlers explained what happened, from the blind man's miraculous healing to Jesus' sin of having done it on the Sabbath. The Pharisees collectively gasped, but only at the Sabbath part, and abandoned their pious poses, nearly hyperventilating in disbelief. One of the Pharisees, a tall one with the most ornate hat, now addressed Zach directly. "Is this true?" he asked, with a practiced scowl, blind to the irony that he was preparing, on the Sabbath, to engage in his all-important task of harshly judging others. "Yes," said Zach. "He put mud in my eyes, and I washed, and now I can see." A pudgy Pharisee with extraordinarily silky earlocks and a dour expression exclaimed, "This man Jesus is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." A couple others heartily agreed and patted him on the back. It seemed that none of them were familiar with Jesus prior to that point, nor what a troublemaker he had already been for other Jewish leaders. A few of the other Pharisees, however, weren't so quick to condemn. "Well, how can a sinner perform such signs?" Then the tall one looked back at Zach. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes that he opened." The Pharisees were wearing thin on Zach's patience, but he tried to keep his cool. He didn't like that some of them were intent on dragging Jesus' name through the dirt. "He's a prophet," he said. With this simple statement, Zach triggered nearly all of the Pharisees. It wasn't their first trip around the block. They had dealt with charlatans before, lots of them. The tall one commanded the others, "Fetch this man's parents." The Pharisees were starting to suspect that Zach wasn't actually born blind. Soon enough, the servants brought Zach's parents before the Pharisees. This was the first time Zach's parents had seen him since his eyes had been opened. They struggled to process what they were seeing and couldn't stop staring. As a matter of practice, Zach's parents avoided the Pharisees as much as possible. The Pharisees brought nothing but harsh judgment. As such, Zach's open eyes filled them with both joy and fear, because they knew that if the Pharisees were involved, something bad was going to happen. In all likelihood, they would be humiliated as a matter of principle. "Is this your son?" the tall one asked, pointing at Zach across the room. "Yes." Some of the Pharisees noticed their confusion upon seeing their son. "Was he born blind?" the tall one continued. "Yes," Spencer said, a tear starting to make its way down Zach's mom's cheek. "Then how is it that he can see?" Unlike the Pharisees, Zach's parents had heard about Jesus and the stories of his fantastic healings. Spencer wondered if Zach had been healed by Jesus, but he also knew that some of the people who claimed that Jesus was the Messiah had been thrown out of the synagogues. Zach's father spoke humbly. "This is my son, who was born blind. Now his eyes have been opened, but I don't know how this happened. Ask him. He can speak for himself." His cagey response frustrated the Pharisees, but it was also becoming clearer that maybe Zach's parents knew absolutely nothing. They weren't getting anywhere with their dramatic inquisition to the parents, so they stormed back over to Zach. In dramatic fashion, the tall one implored him, "Give God the glory by telling the truth. We know this man, Jesus, is a sinner." Zach's frustration was growing, and he didn't like them interrogating his parents. Letting some of his frustration out, he said, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. All I know is that I was blind, but now I can see." "What did he do to you?" they pried further. "How did he open your eyes?" "I've told you this already," said Zach. "You did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Zach was intentionally provoking them now. He couldn't help it. He had already been on the outside of the Jewish fold because of his blindness, and honestly, he didn't really care if he remained there. It was preferable to listening to these conceited windbags. The Pharisees were shocked at his insolence, and having none of it, they all banded together to fling insults at Zach like a one-sided food fight. Then the tall one puffed out his chest and shouted above all the others, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow Jesus, we don't even know where he comes from," he said, punctuating the words as if driving nails into a coffin. "Well, isn't that remarkable?" Zach shouted back, undaunted. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a blind man. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." The tall one was apoplectic. He hesitated, and then remembered what he wanted to say, shouted, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And with that, they threw Zach, and presumably his parents too, out of the synagogue. So Jesus heals a blind man. Nobody had ever heard of such a thing. The man he healed was Jewish, or at least had been born Jewish, and his parents were Jewish. But the man had been marginalized by the Jewish faith because Jewish beliefs at the time held that this birth defect was divine punishment meted out by an all-powerful God. People didn't know what the man did, but they assumed someone did something somewhere to deserve it. In all likelihood, some people treated him that way, as if he or his parents had done something to earn such wrath from God. In many ways, he is symbolic of the many people left behind by the Jewish faith, either because they didn't fit or they never qualified in the first place. As Jesus and his disciples happen along, one of them asks about the blind man's affliction, and Jesus, as he is prone to do, calls out erroneous thinking on the part of Jewish leadership. Unfortunate things happen in life that aren't divine punishment. To make this point, he proceeds to heal the man of his blindness by opening his eyes, and he does it on the Sabbath. This healing is different than many mentioned in the Bible, because unlike other healings that are instantaneous, this one isn't. It requires an act of faith on the part of the blind man, the excluded. He must journey to the pool with mud on his eyes, and only then wash the mud off. He must trust Jesus enough to go through with this ridiculous process. And he does exactly that. He believes, and because of his faith in Jesus, he is healed. He believes and trusts in what Jesus is saying. He listens to and follows him, and then his life is changed. Of course, that isn't the end of the story. Jewish leadership gets involved, but rather than acknowledging the miracle that occurred, they fixate on the fact that it occurred on the Sabbath, the day of rest. Jesus is calling people to move past the rigidity of Mosaic law, but they retreat further into it. Their egos, invested in the status quo, cannot grasp the beauty of what has transpired. It is a story of blindness, but not just that of the blind man, but also that of the Jewish leadership. The difference between the two being that with the blind man, he knew that he was blind. Jewish leadership didn't. They had all the answers. They knew what was right, and they thought they knew what God wanted. It is a story of the crippling power of hubris, how it chokes out any potential for growth. And it is a reminder that Jesus, not the Torah, and in turn not the Bible, in which the Torah is included, is the Word of God, as clearly stated in John 1. It is Jesus who is the light of the world. The story is an allegory for the followers of Jesus who are willing to follow Jesus no matter how ridiculous it may seem to others. They are willing to try to see the world differently through the eyes of love, willing to let go of a world dominated by rules and judgment, of power and conquest, and instead listen to the still small voice within, willing to have their eyes open to the truth of God, the truth of love. And the story echoes of the man at the healing pool. Do you wish to be healed? It echoes of Nicodemus, of needing to be born to a new way of thinking and seeing the world through the eyes of love. It echoes of the wedding at Cana, where simply living by the rules is not enough, but we must live by God's love, alive in Jesus, to find fulfillment. It echoes of Jesus walking on water, where we must have faith as we follow, a willingness to turn our lives, our worries, and our faiths over to God. It is also a warning for those who choose to bury their heads in the sands of the status quo, of what has always been done, and remain in spiritual blindness. Let us always seek God's truth in all that we do. A few years back, I read a story about a man who was completely blind from birth and lived that way until adulthood, when a medical procedure allowed him to see for the first time. What struck me most about the story wasn't curing his blindness. It was that once he was able to see, he was still effectively blind, at least for a while, because he didn't recognize any of the sights, shapes, or colors that were now coming at his brain. Apparently, part of a baby's learning that we all take for granted is the brain learning to assign meaning to all of the visual impulses that we perceive through our eyes. As an adult, he was having to start that learning process, long after the neuroplasticity of his youthful brain had left him, thus making it so much more difficult. It is so difficult to teach old dogs new tricks, yet that is what Jesus seeks to do. We're all old dogs, used to seeing things a certain way, but Jesus wants to help us perceive the world differently. Where we see scarcity, fear, cynicism, dog eat dog, Jesus wants us to feel the true heartbeat of life, love. Where we see boundaries, he is showing us possibility. Where we see division, he is showing us unity, a love across all people, infusing all of life. But we have to let go of our old notions to see it. We have to open our eyes and then regain the plasticity of our minds as children of God, the God of love. We have to learn to embrace the miraculous nature of life. Like other stories in John, many of us want to take this story literally, but when we do so, the meaning of the story becomes confined. While there are other stories involving blind people in the Bible, this story of healing a man born blind is unique to the book of John. It is a story of a man being born with his eyes closed, but then Jesus comes to open them. It is the telling of the revelatory process for all of Jesus' followers. If they are willing to open their eyes, then they may be able to learn to see. When they do, once they open their eyes, they will see things in a way that will threaten others, push others outside of their comfort zones. It will threaten people who are afraid of change, of opening their eyes to the boundless nature of love. And each of these people with newly opened eyes will have a choice to make. Do they retreat into the status quo, making themselves small again to conform to the space allocated to them by others whose eyes remain closed? Or do they move unabashedly into this new space? In this story, the man whose eyes were opened owns this new reality, refusing to retreat into the familiar, to put on blinders so as not to threaten others. He chooses not to fit in. He doesn't know what awaits, but he moves forward in truth nonetheless. Because of this, he is vilified by the old guard and even thrown out of the synagogue by people whose eyes are not yet open, which is exactly what happens to the followers of Jesus prior to the book of John being written. The authors of John are telling this story in parable form and providing a warning of things to come, but ultimately it is a story of liberation, of people being set free by Jesus, by God's love. My sister Karen and I went walking recently when she was back in town for a memorial. On the walk, she told me a story about an old couple she knew. The man was 102 years old and the woman 101. On his last night, the old man, who just loved life, told his wife that he knew that if he went to sleep, he wouldn't awake, and he desperately wanted to witness one more sunrise. So the two of them sat up, keeping each other awake all night long. They wanted to witness one more sunrise together. After they had done this, he passed away later that day. The man's life wasn't always like this. As with all of us, his was full of deep struggles, of his battle with bipolar disorder, and tragedies, including the murder of one of his children. But through it all, his life was transformed. It was redeemed by love. This is the faith we are invited to possess, knowing that with each new day, in spite of whatever pain and suffering we may be experiencing, God's beauty awaits us like a sunrise. We're invited to get swept up, to open our eyes to the beauty of each and every moment, to the peace and understanding that envelops us when we do. We are invited to open our eyes to the love that surrounds us. We are invited to love so deeply that we will stave off death to witness the beauty of one more sunrise surrounded by love. And when we learn to do this, that is when we begin to fully understand the gift of love.